Hey everyone, good evening. My name is Ashish Gupta. I'm Director of Admissions at Jagran Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. And today's session is about the media's role in this pandemic and what exactly is happening in the world of media. With me is Professor Suruchi Majumdar. She is a professor and she is also Assistant Dean of Admissions and Outreach at JSJC. So now I'll request Professor Majumdar to take over the session and interact with you and tell you about how exactly the global media is handling and working on this pandemic and it providing you information on this.
Okay, thank you, Ashish, for introduction and for organizing this webinar, and thanks to all students who have come to attend this webinar. So I am an assistant professor here at the journalism school, and I have to tell you a little bit about myself. I was a working journalist. I was a print journalist in India. I worked with various reputed print media like Indian Express in Bombay, Hindustan Times, and then I went to Singapore for my higher studies, and I had a higher degree from Nanyang Technological University. And so I largely teach courses on global media and politics. So, and today we are going to be speaking about China, and as you all know, with the current health crisis that we are dealing with, like there is a pandemic that the entire world is going through, and so China is, as you might know, is actually at the center of all this discussion, right? So as we are dealing with a major pandemic, there are a number of deaths. It's a kind of there is a massive global shutdown almost in all over the world except for maybe Sweden, one country, and that is actually leading us to a great major economic crisis also, apart from the health crisis. But as we deal with this, we are also witnessing another crisis that some of you may not be aware of, like a crisis of journalism, a crisis of media, right? So China is at the center of this crisis of global journalism that we are happening. So as you might, some of you you might be reading, following some news. If not for newspapers, I think newspapers is actually for prehistoric people like me. We read newspapers. For everybody else, I'm sure you look at news following on your apps, but you might be aware that recently, as in India also, as well as in many parts of the world, as we are dealing with a health crisis, there is also a lot of xenophobic sentiments that are directed against people. In India, we have actually, in the beginning, we were in many places, many regions, we saw people who look Asian. So these people are actually from here. Many people are from northeastern part of the country, from northeastern regions. So we thought that these are Chinese people, and we kind of directed attacks. So that's something we saw. Later on, again, we saw that after there was a massive religious congregation, there were a lot of high-pitched debate in India, in the Indian context, targeting people from one particular community. That is also has happened. Similarly, actually, you might see that in many European countries, there were kind of direct attacks directed against people, Asians, Chinese, and also by Asians, I mean people, Thais, Singaporeans, anybody who kind of racially who would have look Asian to those, to Europeans, they were, target of hatred. So they were attacked, they were abused. Somebody asked to kind of get down from a bus, not to enter a shop. And so the question, the media in this entire crisis, it plays a very, very important role. So you might know that in what sense, like I'm sure everybody from, as you followed your apps, as as India kind of is dealing with its own crisis of the deadly virus, that, initial reports, it's largely this coronavirus, it was actually originated after some people were discovered to be ill in the Chinese city of Wuhan, right? And so there are many theories around it, and so where it came and where how it emerged. So there are multiple. There is an information war that has actually started around this. So one vision, on one side of this information war is actually dealing with there are many Western media reports, starting from certain American politicians. In fact, the American president himself, he tweeting that it's actually a Wuhan virus. It's actually a Chinese virus. That's how it started. And then apart from these attacks on the Chinese people, they said there were many kind of allegations that were directed against China, right? So that is also, and this led to some kind of deep xenophobic sentiments, right? Xenophobic meaning it's a largely anti-China sentiments, like against Chinese people, against Chinese government, right? And so there were not just individual politicians who kind of tweeted about this, but there was also the large international mainstream media. They also played a certain role in this. So that is what we're going to be discussing today. And we'll also see that, how did China respond to it? What is China's response? And what kind of, political changes that are happening? What kind of international relations is actually unfolding that is created this kind of a parallel crisis alongside the health, alongside the pandemic that we are seeing today. So I think I'll just want to kind of show you one small video. If it plays, I'll try my best to play this. If it plays, it's well. Otherwise, I'll go on to this. So I just want to share my screen here.
Is first, and you're watching the listening post. Here.
I hope everybody can see this. Ashish, is my screen visible to everyone?
Yeah, the screen is visible.
Okay, so I'm just trying to play a video.
Sure.
For some of the coronavirus stories, the media angles will be covering from home this week. For some governments, the battle against COVID-19 is being fought on multiple fronts: medical, informational, and ideological. We'll look at the history of misinformation in the coverage of viral pandemics by taking you back more than a century to the story of the Spanish flu. Plus, filmmakers in isolation. An animator goes dark. As they've been isolating their populations to keep the coronavirus contained, some powerful governments are simultaneously waging a worldwide war of perceptions, laying out how the pandemic happened, where the responsibilities lie, and which country should lead the fighting. China is out to shift the narrative from its initially slow response, the way its censors kept a lid on the story, to the collective effort since then to bring down the infection rate. Beijing has also borrowed a page from Moscow's playbook, using mainstream and social media platforms to spread conspiracy theories and mug perceptions. In Washington, the campaign to brand COVID-19 the Chinese virus is being led by the man at the top, President Donald Trump. This story has grown into a debate about competing ideologies, a global one, played out through the media, of what the world will look like once the pandemic is over, and which political system, which superpower will be best placed to lead. Our starting point this week is the geopolitical battle over narratives around COVID-19.
So just to get back to our presentation. So that is what I played. I just now played a small, it's a longer documentary at this news channel called Al Jazeera that some of you may have heard of. So Al Jazeera is actually doing a kind of documentary on the information war that is currently unleashed. As I mentioned earlier, there is also on one side it's China, on the other side it's the US, right? So this is the information war. And so as I mentioned again earlier, so we have seen that, the US president, he tweeted that this is actually a Wuhan virus. There were other people from the political establishment in the US who's kind of associated this virus, calling it's only a Chinese virus. The common global sentiment that kind of initiated with the US, and it kind of finds a lot of resonance elsewhere, is that this virus was actually a biological weapon created by China in its secret laboratories in Wuhan. And this was used for China to kind of, attack on humanity, kind of have an edge on the US, and to have some kind of upper hand over the US. So a lot of conspiracy theories that go on. And on the other hand, of course, and they were very critical that the US has been critical that initial phase, there were, as the disease was unfolding in the US, in Chinese city Wuhan, there were many people, there were many whistleblowers, many journalists who wanted to kind of alert the authorities. So Chinese, government, they, did not let this information come out. So that is also another subject of criticism. And also there is a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of, here you can see in my video, there is also a picture of like a wet market in Wuhan, right? So this is where apparently the virus was first found, and some people who had been, who had visited this, wet market, they were reportedly, they were, they caught this virus, right? This is the scenario. So there are also certain kind of misconception around what are these wet virus, what are these wet markets. And so, as you can see in the slide, people have certain idea about that, especially Westerners. And also here we think that, Chinese eat dogs, they eat bats, and they eat, pangolins, and that's how the disease spreads, right? This is the general view. So also, if you may have noticed the video, the Al Jazeera video that I just played, it says that this is also a kind of ideological war. So what is this ideological war? I mean, what are we talking about? I mean, this is that is a kind of key topic of discussion for us. Firstly, as it says that, anytime there has been a major pandemic, so for instance, in 1918, the world saw a Spanish flu, right? So during the Spanish flu also, we targeted like there were certain communities which were against whom the world associated them with the disease. That's why we called it Spanish flu. It was seen to have emerged from Spain, and basically it was the disease became a major pandemic because of the the soldiers who had just returned from First World War, and they had kind of traveled, and the disease traveled with them. That's the idea. But we tend to do that. There is a history behind associating certain communities with a particular disease. That is the history part of it. But in the current sense, there is actually a ideological war that is going on, right? So what is this ideological war? Why is actually people so skeptical of China, right? What is the reason? So I'm sure, we know there has been a lot of discussion on China. What are the various things? If I had asked you what are the different, if I say the word China and I ask you to write down a few adjectives describing this country, what are the various adjectives you would write? Most likely you would say China is a communist country. It is a very tightly controlled country. That is, you think it's a country which is very authoritarian. There is some kind of thought control. The government is not a very democratic government, right? That is what we think. On the other hand, you think also China, also some of you may know that China is also a place, where it is economically doing very well. And obviously for many of us in India, that is also, we are also, concerned that India shares territorial border with China. So we are also kind of engaged time and again. China is part of our headlines. So if I ask you to write down a few points, you would say that it's a communist country, and it is generally it's an authoritarian country as opposed to many other countries. Say it's probably an India also, and also it's a rising power, it's a rising superpower. Some of you may know that it's also an Asian powerhouse. Some of you can name, there is a huge economic success. Chinese cities are very advanced, many of you know, but also there is a history to this ideological war, right? During the Cold War, as you might know, that there were two blocks. One was the American bloc, which was actually the liberal, democratic. It is also the capitalist country. On the other hand was Soviet Union, Russia, which was also the socialist country. So that ended, the Cold War ended. We know that the Soviet Union fell, and the US became as the major, it became the world in the after 1989, after the Soviet Union fell. And some of you may have studied it in your history class, that the world became like a unipolar power, meaning just there is a one big power, superpower, that is the US, right? But then what happened from the 2000 end onwards, or actually from mid 2005-6, this Asian country, earlier people would be not so much bothered about the Chinese story. Suddenly China started to become flourish as an economic success, right? It had changed. It was still an authoritarian country, but it started to follow a kind of economic model that was also very close to a capitalist model, right? So then on one hand, there was a kind of worry that actually China is emerging as a global power, and it is going to replace the West, or replace the the US. And then the China also, it retained its political power, right? And it kind of started to experiment with a global, a capitalist model of production. That some of you may be familiar with these terms in your school, in your economics or history class in like 12th or 11th standards. So then in many cases what we saw, that there was an anxiety around the rise of global China. And in many cases, sometimes people thought that actually during the Cold War, as the Soviet Union, Russia, it wasn't a major global power anymore since the 1990s, and the US emerged as a big power. People actually thought that actually, this kind of liberal democratic model that many countries follow, also India also has regular elections. So people thought that actually most countries will also follow this direction, because earlier Soviet Union was authoritarian countries, but then controlled by Moscow, but then Soviet Union fell. Many other countries, say Bulgaria, Hungary, these were all part of the Soviet Union. They became independent countries, and they started to have like the parliamentary democracy, right? So then they thought that it's also the China is going to be following the same path, right? But it never happened. Chinese government became more and more powerful, right? And after the Chinese president Xi Jinping came to, became the president in 2013, China has become even more, the Chinese government led by the Communist Party, it has become even more powerful, right? And so largely the Western media, by Western media, I mean it's the New York Times, CNN, BBC. So largely, if I say that these are all privately run corporations, but most of the time these countries, they have these media outlets, they have presence across the world. And BBC, you can listen, watch a BBC service from everywhere. So these are global media, but they actually originate from most Western countries. In some cases, they also shared the anxiety of these Western governments, like the American and other places. Meaning, journalism, how would it function? In many cases, when it comes to reporting China, they would actually say that the current focus of a newspaper like New York Times would say, for instance, how the Chinese government is actually crushing, suppressing dissent, right? So that is true, and the good journalism should actually write about that. But in many cases, what China actually, made certain allegations. They said when this New York Times is covering, a report covering that there is certain pro-democracy protest is happening. So you guys must have heard of Tibet, which is controlled by China, but there is a separatist struggle in Tibet. So then there are dissenters in Tibet protesting against the Chinese government, and the Chinese government wants to suppress this. So China's allegation is that when the Western media report this, they always give the one-sided view, right? There is always an anxiety, and that they are reporting these various anti-government protests that happened many times in China. They reported that, and they give a very, very biased view. That was China's allegation against Western media. And to some extent, they shared, I mean, when it comes to, so for instance, certain stories were actually ignored by, say, NYT, that is New York Times, the BBC, CNN. Certain stories, they were kind of more newsworthy than other stories. For instance, if there is a story where mass protest is happening, that is more newsworthy. But also the Chinese government, till China also had a massive poverty reduction, right? For instance, China has universal education for all people. But then the Chinese government's allegation is that these good stories, these positive stories are not always told, right? So that is the allegation of the Chinese government. So, and this is how, and as China became more and more powerful, the anxiety around China kind of increased. So in 2008, there was a financial crisis that some of you may be aware of. And so during the financial crisis, the Western, again in many Western countries, people had, many banks were actually kind of in massive debt. But in that sense, many Asian countries, especially China, they kind of did not face the brunt of this financial crisis, right? So these were some of the, but then this created certain kind of anxiety around the Chinese story. So then I just want to draw your attention to the story. Like if I open this, so there is a story that Time magazine did. If you can see my screen, so they ran a story say, is China actually doing capitalism better than the US? So these stories, in many cases, China actually says that in many cases when they do the stories, Time magazine is a privately run company, right? These are in China, most media, they're controlled by the state, but in rest of the world, these are privately run corporations. But even though we see that even though BBC, CNN, Fox News, these are not directly owned by the government. BBC obviously is a different model, right? CNN, Fox, but in some sense, in many time and again, they have kind of ended up representing the views of the American government. And so there are many reasons for it. So if you study journalism, you will get to know these reasons. For a journalist, when you report a story, your main source, your main information that you get from your sources. Who are your sources? It has to be an authentic, valid source. So in many cases, what we do is that they generally get this information from government and administrative sources, and that shapes their story. So bottom line, if I just kind of cut the long story short, in many cases, the Western media, they represented the view of the governments in reporting on China, right? In some cases, journalists reported, many pro-democracy protests in China, and they, as a good news media, they should do it. But China's allegation is that they always presented a one-sided view. So then, this particular trend is also somewhat in play when it comes to reporting this anxiety around the Chinese involvement in a global pandemic, right? That is something. So now I'll come to the next point. In what sense, in what way China actually responded to this, right? So then, if you have, China did something, there is a term that was actually coined by many international media. It is called a Covet diplomacy. So China initially was very slow to respond to this crisis. As you know, there were many reports, the whistleblowers in China, who wanted to report the story, but the Chinese government, many local authorities, they wanted to suppress this information. So even one of the whistleblower is somebody who's actually shares, actually breaks a story or goes against authority and gives a leak, and that becomes a story, right? So whistleblowers, one of the doctors who wanted to share the story, but then that doctor was actually penalized in China for reporting that there is actually a major epidemic. So that is actually unfolding. At that point, it wasn't a pandemic yet, right? So there was it's undeniable that there was some kind of an information suppression at this point, right? But then China had been very crucial to respond to this. On one hand, China has a controlled this disease. So that takes us to the main point of our story, of our presentation, of our discussion, that how did China was able to control this disease in such a sophisticated, in such a prompt way, even though the disease has made resurfaced in later weeks, but then it was very quick to control this disease. The way it has actually manifested in Italy or the US, it wasn't the case in China. So China, even it's a authoritarian government, it has with a huge economic success. China also has one of the world's most sophisticated media outlets and a very sophisticated technological infrastructure, right? That some of you may not be aware of. China has a major, global media, right? Say starting from global news agency Xinhua, that not only provides news in Chinese language, but also in more than 20 international languages, including English, Persian, Spanish. Plus, over the last few years, China's key goal for development is big data, artificial and intelligence, right? China has a very sophisticated, one of the major big companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu. These are the three big internet companies that have a massive global footprint across the world, right? So then that also in the current day, it also means China has a very sophisticated surveillance strategy, right? So I'm sure many of you may be familiar with this term, right? All the time when we are using this mobile phone, we are kind of chatting. There is also a massive data, like all the big companies such as Facebook, Amazon, they also kind of collect all our information. There have been many political scandals where these big companies have actually shared all our information, that is our data, with governments. They always do that with private corporations. So then when there is that is also currently the biggest concern for the digital media, like your constant use of this digital phone that involves that your data is being actually leaked, and this is collected by private corporations. So in the Chinese case, actually, there are a few big companies. One is Baidu, which is the Chinese Google. Then there is Alibaba, which is the Chinese Amazon. And there is a WeChat, which is like the Facebook / Twitter / Uber, and plus there is also a Chinese Uber called Daishi, right? So then these companies like the Baidu, Alibaba, these are among the major internet companies, and these, though they are private corporations, they have close links with the state. So what I'm trying to get at is that how did China actually made use of these big companies to kind of have put in place a very, very strong surveillance apparatus, right, by which it could detect and track who's going where, who's actually communicating with whom. So this kind of control of your movement, this kind of control was only possible because it's a authoritarian country. It is less possible in many other places, right? So China was able to control this disease by making use of its sophisticated technological infrastructure, right? So that is less possible, and also that is also in many cases that is also not desirable, because it goes against your private rights, it goes against your privacy, it goes against your civil liberties, right? So but then this was possible in China, but then it had certain social impact too. So then it managed to control this disease, right? So then after the disease was controlled, China was launched a major media campaign to say to do something which has been described as Covet diplomacy, right? So then I will just again play like one small video, and then I'll come back to it again, and I will explain what is Covet diplomacy, and then we will see also the China in what sense is actually the kind of addressed this whole issue in the Chinese media, right?
Late March in Serbia, and a plane has just landed at Belgrade Airport. This is no ordinary flight. On board are medical teams and tons of equipment to help fight the coronavirus. They've flown in from China, and they get a hero's welcome. The president himself is here. Serbia isn't the only place welcoming deliveries like this. Chinese supplies have also been arriving in Hungary, as well as the Czech Republic.
So I think there is a problem in playing the video. I will just stop it here. So the bottom line, as you see, what China has done, this is, it is, as the video shows, this is a video that is actually made by the, it's a German television network, like, you know, they have made this, you know, video, or they have created this news program. This is available on YouTube. So what they have done is that they have shown that basically Chinese medical experts, China is providing aid to all these countries, starting with Serbia. Serbia is a place within Russia. So then, sorry, my mistakes. Serbia is not in Russia. So it's going to Serbia, it is going to Hungary, to all these places. China is actually Czech Republic. These are places in the East European countries, right? And so China is offering medical support to these, you know, places, and China is actually sending its team of medical workers who are going there to help people. So China is actually somebody who's helping certain countries in need. So if you look at Siberia, this is a small country. If you look at Hungary, small country, Czech Republic, so they're somewhat not economically, China is way economically powerful than them. So then China is kind of launching that this is actually helping bigger smaller countries as a bigger economy, as a, you know, as a well-meaning brother. China is actually helping people, right? That is the narrative China created, and that is called a Covet diplomacy, right? So again, that has some kind of a context. China in the last few years, it also, you know, increased its interaction with you know, many African countries. It has launched certain economic projects in African countries. It has launched an initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative, which means they launched infrastructure projects that would, like railways, you know, bridges, and they would originate in China, and they would kind of be transcontinental, means say it goes from China to Africa, right? And it crosses massive landmarks. And also it is creating a digital infrastructure, which is called a digital Silk Road. So where China is actually, you know, creating a certain massive, you know, technological infrastructure where many Chinese companies will be able to do business, internet companies will be able to do business, create an open market in many of these countries through which this road passes. And then China also has a you know, increased its relationship with Africa, as I said, in terms of giving aids, donation, right? So Africa, many places, these are poor countries. So China is building, you know, dams. It is creating shopping malls, development projects, airports, right? So then it has a renewed, better relationship. So then it is also many places, many people, when it comes to the Western media coverage or the, you know, global media coverage of this, they say that China is also having some kind of a, you know, control, a neo-colonial control, you know, the way British colonized India and other countries way back in the 19th century and also in the till the mid 20th century. In the same way, China is actually controlling the economics of African countries and becoming like a new colonial, acting as a colonial power, not by controlling politics, but by controlling their economic, right? That is the general perception about China. So China, in this moment of crisis, it launched what it launched. It launched a Covet diplomacy. Like it is actually a well-meaning big brother. It is sending medical supplies to places. It is helping people, as you can saw through this. DW, this German news media company, is actually creating this news program. And also there have been a systematic study of how and then how did China actually change, in what way kind of China transmitted its messages. Since 2008, the Chinese government has invested in a massive communication network. So if I say Chinese media, I'm sure most of you will say that it's a state-owned media. That is true. But also, even though they're state-owned media, most of these media outlets in China, they operate like your CNN, BBC. They are present in the US. So for instance, here, if you can see my screen, this is CCTV and this is CGTN. This is actually the China Global Television Network. They do news actually in English. They do news in multiple languages. So Xinhua News Agency is one such. And also the way India has a huge number of news media outlets. China has so many provinces. Those provinces also have a massive communication media, news media channels, television channels, radio, newspapers, hundreds and thousands of them, just like the case in India. And not always they are directly owned by the Communist Party. It's not like one Communist Party is kind of running the shots. There is obviously some heavy censorship. That journalists are answerable to the party. That is true. But also at the same time, China is also very decentralized. So there are multiple regional media. Those regional media are controlled by the local Communist Party leaders. So they control it. And also China, even though it's a state-owned media, in many cases, Chinese journalists have done very, very, path-breaking journalism, right? So there is a Chinese financial magazine called Caixin. So there they have actually reported extensively done investigative stories, right? So if I do say investigative stories, you guys would all be surprised that, how come investigative stories possible within China. So then this talks about these, really brave journalists who have, followed, completely tracked stories, uncovered corruption, found that how certain government policies are actually penalizing, persecuting people. So they have done some extensive stories, and in many cases, they, in some way, they have managed the censorship strategy in a multiple way. They have kind of made sure to overcome. They have been Chinese journalists have been very smart to evade these various massive censorship mechanism that is present. So why I'm saying this is that this shows that China also has a very strong tradition of journalism. It is not that the state is dictating everything. So that explains that the Chinese media also has a global presence, and also now China is one of the most cash-rich countries. In most cases, many media outlets, they have, after the post 2008 era, things have shaped, really badly. Many media outlets ran out of, advertising, but China gets that money from the government. So they have been able to hire the most sophisticated, news anchors across the world, right? But obviously, when it comes to global news, China follow certain strategies, make sure that these news that they actually broadcast in these multiple countries, they actually make sure the Chinese government's foreign policy aim is actually, fulfilled. That is one thing. Also, China follows another strategy. They employ, they work with a number of local journalists. For instance, the China Global Television Network, they have a massive presence in India, and they work with many Indian journalists who actually do stories for them. So they just cover local news. something, what is the coronavirus story, you know, the number of deaths per day in India. So then there is then in that case, China's censorship mechanism wouldn't work unless it is something directly affecting the Beijing government. The censorship becomes active. So China provides a lot of local news all over the world, including India. Plus, China has a massive technological infrastructure, right? So when it comes to the tech infrastructure, big data and artificial intelligence, they want to use it for social purposes that they have done, also to create economic opportunity for its internet companies, and also it wants to emerge as the leading tech player by 2050, where by when they would have, like, you know, massive advancements in robotics with flying cars. This is actually the Chinese technological dream that is being driven. So this is the within this backdrop, this China's attempt to tell its coronavirus story is also unfolding. So here is a video. This has been done by the New York Times and it's there on YouTube, which has done a very systematic, it reports a systematic study done by researchers talking about how the news coverage changed in China, right? So then I'll just play this.
The Chinese government has one of the most extensive propaganda networks in the world inside the country, but it also aggressively influence how it's perceived outside its borders. China has invested billions bolstering its image abroad. Its state-run news outlets push out messages in English. Messages in English around the clock.
You're watching TGTS live in Beijing from my Washington, D.C.
And its diplomats have flocked there in the last year. But what happens when this massive PR apparatus has to do major damage control? We analyzed thousands of tweets from Chinese state media and official accounts and found three dominant messages China wants to project to the world. Here's what we learned. A novel coronavirus hit the Chinese city of Wuhan in January. Early whistleblowers, silence. People were angry about a government cover-up. In the majority of tweets we analyzed, state-owned publications pushed a much more optimistic view, promoting what they said was an effective response. They were sharing videos like this. The Chinese Communist Party refers to this as positive energy, only focusing on the bright side of an issue. China did take drastic measures to try and stem the outbreak, but that's the only story China wants the world to see. The state media is eager to run praise from foreign experts to back up China's successes.
It's a remarkable response that's being organized in China to contain.
One tweet from state media that did reveal Chinese citizens' discontent was quickly deleted. Once the virus spread across the world, China started positioning itself as being at the forefront of fighting the pandemic. It presented itself as a partner, a grateful recipient, and more recently, a selfless leader, highlighting large donations from Chinese companies and the government. China hasn't typically disparaged other countries' responses to the virus, with one exception, the United States.
President Donald Trump has been accused of denying, downplaying, and outright rejecting the concerns over the COVID-19 outbreak.
Another thing we noticed are Chinese outlets disputing the origin of the virus. It all started in late February with a renowned Chinese epidemiologist. Around the same time, the CDC reported the first case in the United States with an unknown origin. A screenshot of the announcement, incorrectly translated in Chinese, began to trend online and was untouched by Chinese government censors. And a high-ranking government spokesperson
Okay, so I'll just stop the video here. So, as you said that, as you can see that there have been a change in how the Chinese media, responded to it. It was analyzed from the tweets shared by the various, accounts. So there, basically they started with a propaganda effort, talking about optimism. Then it quickly went on to disparaging the efforts of the United States. It's kind of it goes into the entire China-US war that is currently unleashed, and also that has a large history to it, which we kind of briefly discussed. And thirdly, it is saying also that it is also trying to protect its image, and also it's kind of, there is a major dispute on where the virus actually originated, and that is also remains at the center of this crisis, right? So then US is saying this is a Wuhan virus. These wet markets are actually the storehouse of infection, right? But there are multiple views to it, which says that wet markets are actually common in many parts of the world, including in many Asian countries. When people say that the Chinese eat bats and pangolins, it is not that common, but also at the same time, this shows that even though when you're actually killing wildlife, this shows a larger global trend too. That is something to be, a good journalist should also report it. On the other hand, China is also increasing its propaganda effort. It is saying actually the US has somehow secretly brought this virus, and currently, which the video doesn't show, it also the Chinese media is trying to portray, the Chinese government is trying to say that actually we are not kind of taking any responsibility for the virus, and now China is clean, the foreigners are the ones who are involved in it, right? So both, there are kind of major flaws in both narratives, the US narrative, the American narrative, and also the Chinese narrative. So where do we find the good story? Where do we find the real story? And that is why a good journalist's job becomes essential. And so there is a lot of that is also being written about in terms of when it comes to a journalist writing about these global issues, what is your position? Where is the truth? How will you find the truth? So then, I just almost about to end my talk, so I will just end with a film. I can't be showing the film, but I will just end mentioning this film called Contagion. It's a 2011 film. I don't know many of you have seen it or not, but obviously during this lockdown, there have been, a number of times this film was actually being screened in Amazon Prime. So this shows actually a pandemic, and it's like exactly the kind of way we are going through. And it's the same case, the virus. Actually, this somebody who's returning from a short trip from Hong Kong, she kind of catches this virus, and then it kind of becomes a major, it kind of it emerges as a major contagion, right? So then the film ends with a note, right? That is true, that they show that actually the forest, there is a forest, a tree suddenly that is being cut, that is being felled, and a bat which is there in a tree that kind of flies and comes to human surrounding, like near a pig, but then the bats are supposed to be wild animals, they are not supposed to come near the livestock, which is a pig. And then it's going to be eating, the bat is eating a banana, and the pig catches it. Then that pig is actually taken to a place and it's butchered. And this is the the chef actually is kind of making some dish out of that pork, and that's how the virus spread. So my point of the story is not to kind of encourage certain vegetarianism, but the point is to show about the environmental crisis that the world is actually plunging into. And that happens because of many of countries, including China. The US has been the global leader. The more and more we kind of encourage this kind of industrial mode of production, right? Our phones are being made, most of our we are playing, we are using ACs, air conditioning, our income levels are going up. That is causing major damage to the environment. So the role of a good journalist is not to target the US, not to target the China, not to target certain communities, but to see the larger story. What is the bigger story? What is the deep-rooted, truth here? So then it is actually, it is just as one of the, major, biologist who wrote, said, or his name is Bob Wallace. He said in an interview that it's actually incidental, that actually it originated from China. The person that is to be blamed is actually the global pharmaceutical industry, because they have not invested in a virus. They have actually, and certain corporate big manufacturing companies, they have flouted a number of industrial norms to kind of launch into a major massive production cycle, right? So that is the key culprit here. So my goal is not to target sentiments, specific communities, social groups. I should not encourage blaming one country, anti-US, anti-China. That is not the goal for a, better world. So the role of a good journalist is actually to pursue the good story, right? What is it that the people who are the power holders are doing? What is it that they're not doing? And why is it that there isn't a virus? And why is it that a bat suddenly comes to a place where it is actually the virus is being transmitted, right? So these larger questions, it is for the goal of a journalist to do. In some cases, the internet, many digital platforms, there have been number of articles. Alternative media have done these stories. They have interviewed experts who have spoken about it. So at the current media landscape, in this era of information war, we need more and more stories like this. So I'll stop here. So if there are any questions, please write in the question box.
Yes, ma'am. There are few questions the students have asked. So Devanshi has asked
Okay.
that it is a physical disease. So how exactly did the media become helpful to government to get over the pandemic?
Okay, so then it is a physical disease, but actually in many cases the media play a very important it is a very crucial journalists play a very crucial role by providing truthful information to contain this disease. That is not always, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be repeating what the government says, right? So then you might Devanshi, you may have heard of the famous economist Amartya Sen's name. He's a Nobel, he won a Nobel Prize. So he actually said that, it's actually after India, after it became independent, it had a free press. And then it had a free press, it had a democracy. And then the press was able to share information about the famines that was happening. And that created a certain kind of public opinion, that created certain public pressure, and that forced the government to take the certain measure. So, and that's why famines did not exist after independence. It only existed before independence. So the media and journalism have a very important role to play when it comes to coping with a pandemic, by providing truthful information, not by, not by reporting or repeating what the government says. Okay, any more question?
Pravya has asked that how do we encounter fake news related to China, especially in India, where the confirmation bias of the people does not let them see the truth?
So, this is actually a, very important question. It's actually a kind of policy problem that, policymakers across the world, they're grappling with. So then it's actually there is a internet companies have to play a major role in this. It is not, you may have seen that, Facebook, WhatsApp recently, 7-8 months back, it kind of released a number of advertisements talking about how people should be more, responsible. So it's the onus is not always on the people. Obviously, you kind of make awareness, you create certain positive democratic values in society, but apart from that, the technological giants such as Facebook, etc., they need to play a more positive role. That doesn't mean that you just abruptly censor valid information and communication. So what is currently happening in India, anything that is generally being critical of the government or the authorities, the Facebook or mainly Facebook, they will just take it down, because there are number of users, they will go ahead and complain against one particular user. So that is not the way forward. So here it is the onus and the responsibility lies with big technological giants. So they need to sit down with certain academic interest groups, researchers, scholars, and also certain representatives of the government, non-government organizations, and come up with a policy in how to make sure that fake news is controlled and make sure that there has to be more, a lot of hateful information is also curbed, right? So that's my response to it. So any
there's
other
one more
question?
question. There's more question which
Yes.
says that China is most likely
China is
a
more?
private country which has created the firewall. More likely a private country which has created firewalls around it. So do you think there'll be a free media anytime in China?
So, China, the political reform, that's a question of free media, meaning it's a question of political reform. So that is unlikely. China is not going towards a path of political reform, right? That is the key question here. But also you need to see China in the current global context. All over the world, starting from India to US to Hungary, which we discussed earlier, right? So there is a trend of many authoritarian governments, like very, very strongly right-wing governments. They're cutting down on media freedom. They're attacking on journalists. So China's after Xi Jinping came to power in China, the China's Communist Party's control has also increased, right? So earlier, whatever promise of political reform that existed in China, that doesn't exist anymore, right? So that is the larger global issue. But when you talk about free media, I think one needs to see that who is actually a free media. Do you think the media that exist in India, they are free media? Well, they are not controlled or financed by the government. Well, they get advertising revenues from government here, but well, they are not directly, owned by the government, let's say. But in many cases, the Indian media are not doing adequate to actually challenge the government. They're also in many cases not free, because there are many kind of censorship that exists, and that emerges because of the current revenue model, like in terms of the advertising, in terms of who's owning the media. So that's a complex global problem that is also not again unique to China. So in that sense, what the world and China need to work towards is that to find of a good financing model, that we are not just dependent on advertising revenues, including government advertising revenues, and come up with a way to actually promote good journalism. The internet kind of showed some way. There are various methods that have come up along this. So, but political reform is not very realistic to hope for in Chinese context at the moment.
Right. So
Any
that
other
brings
question?
to that. No, ma'am. So this is it. That brings to an end to this session of today.
Okay,
I thank
excellent.
you.
I hope students enjoyed this session. So, Ashish would have my email ID. I actually research on China, so then on Chinese media actually. So if you have any questions on Chinese media, Chinese journalism, the Chinese technological infrastructure, so please feel free to get to me, and I will, try to respond to you as best as I can. Okay.
So I'll
So
encourage
thank
all
you,
the
Ashish.
attendees to visit our website, which is jsjc.edu.in, wherein you have all the details of admissions team as well as our faculty members, and you can reach out to us for further queries. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. Thanks a lot, ma'am, for your time.
Thank you very much.